Hello, welcome. Okay, so I've been meaning to do this presentation for a while now, and what I want to talk about is a linguistic theory which I've been developing over the last 2 years, based off my own sort of glossopoetic experience, and also based on a couple of things that I wrote a while ago. And I wanted to do like a lecture series on aestheticalism and almost provide a foundation for viewing language in an artistic way rather than in the conventional sort of linguistic way. I've designed a sort of lecture series which I want to go through. It's not going to be a long one. It's going to be maybe around about 6 parts. I'm still sort of fleshing it out, but I wanted to do this one to begin with, because I think, I've written about this in some of my published works, and I wanted to go through in depth about what I actually mean when I talk about aestheticalism. So what I've done is designed a short sort of lecture series based on it. I hope you find it interesting. It is very much influenced from a glossopoetic perspective, so from the perspective of a language creator, and I think this is why I really wanted to do a series on it, because I think there's a lot that language construction can tell us about languages, which isn't usually found in mainstream linguistics and in linguistics in general. Anyway, there's a lot that we have discovered as language creators, which is just not so obvious to us as maybe coming at it from a purely positivist and scientific view. So this is what I've designed. This course. I would like to do a book on it in the future, but for now I just think I'd like to just do an introduction lecture series and just go over the sort of the finer points. So let's just get started. So first of all, I'll just talk to you about me. So my name is down there. So I'm David. Okay. Now, just quickly about me. So I live in Spain. So I moved from the United Kingdom back in 2017, and I moved to Madrid, Spain, which is where I'm currently living, and I've been here for 4 years now. Yeah, for about 4 years, and I've been inventing languages since I was 11. So my first language that I ever invented was Eldic, and I did actually release a book this year on the grammar of Eldic and going through it in quite a lot of detail. And so I've been inventing languages since I was 11. The first language I ever created was Hutparatian, and Hutparatian was my first sort of dabble into both linguistics and to languages and language creation and glossopoeia and so on. I first started getting interested in languages when I was 11, but I don't think I really got into it until I was around about 14, when I learned Esperanto for the first time, because I was failing in my Spanish classes, and then after learning Esperanto and actually getting interested in grammar and things, I started progressing. So that was that's been my that's for how long I've been sort of creating languages. And as I mentioned, I've published 2 books on language creation, and I'll just show them here. So I've published on glossopoetics, which was my first one that I published during the pandemic back in 2020, and it is just a collection of essays on language as art. And it was in this book that I first sort of started developing the ideas of aesthetics being crucial to language, and aesthetics being a crucial part of language, of language's essence in a way. And I develop on a lot of things. A lot of what I've got here in these lectures are the adaptations of those essays into more of a sort of a linguistic theory, which is what I've provided here in these courses, in this courseware lecture series. It's all my own ideas, nothing about this is going to be, to try and persuade anyone. It's just getting the ideas out there. So I published that during the pandemic, and it was a really quite foundational for me. I wrote, it was my first book that I ever published, and I go back over it a lot of the time. There's not much that I've written that I disagree with now, because often I do write things and then I disagree with them later. I think more or less I've stuck with it, but any sort of corrections I'm going to make in later books to come. But the thing with this book on glossopoetics was that it was purely about language construction, purely in the nature of language creation that I did this book, and not much to do with actual linguistics, actual natural languages. So it was purely on that kind of theory of how to do glossopoeia. What is glossopoeia? What are we as glossopoeists when we create languages? It was on that grounds. So this is more of the elaboration of this to fit a wider linguistic context. My next book, A Grammar of Eldic, as I mentioned before, I published this year. And it was the product of many years of language construction. I didn't put everything I wanted to in it because it didn't all fit, unfortunately, but that is that's the book that I published this year. It's just a detailed grammar on everything to do with my language Eldic, and I remember posting that in the Facebook group for conlanging, for constructed languages, and it seemed to have a nice reception, so I was quite happy about that. But anyway, okay, so enough about me. We're going to go into more in depth about what is aestheticalism. So first of all, I want to just go and just talk about sort of the basics of where the theory comes from and what it actually means. Okay, so aestheticalism is looking at language from an artistic point of view. Okay, so it's looking at languages not from a scientific point of view necessarily. There is empiricism in it. There is, there is objectivity in this, but it's not looking at it from a purely scientific point of view. It's treating language from an artistic perspective. So when we look at languages, and when we look at language, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more depth as well, we're actually looking at it from a more of an artistic point of view than a purely scientific one. Now, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. But the reason for this, and I think there's actually a need for this when we're talking about languages, because I think there is a fundamental thing that we're missing out when we talk about languages. But as I said, we're going to have a look into this. But it is an artistic perspective on language. It is a theory which is based on glossopoeia. Okay, so glossopoeia is language creation. So it's taking what we can understand from languages and about languages in a glossopoetic context, and extrapolating that into a wider view of how natural languages function, what their purpose is, and how they came about. I mean, that's really what we want to try and answer with aestheticalism. Okay, so it is a non-positivist approach, not in everything, but generally it is a more deductive approach. Almost, if for those of you who have studied any kind of economics, it has some elements of a praxeological approach. I'm not particularly partial to praxeology in this in necessarily economic context or even linguistic context, but there is a certain element of it being adapted to suit the subject of study, in this case languages, rather than language adapted to suit the study or from a positivist approach and a purely scientific approach. It is, however, an empirical approach, and we're going to be having a look at things that exist and using evidence to have a look and see what to understand languages a bit better. But it is a more deductive approach than a purely positivist one. Okay. Now, this is probably more controversial, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this as well. It is focused on external language rather than internal language. Now, for most people who do any kind of introductory linguistics courses, they are often introduced to these concepts of e-language and I-language. And we're going to have a look into those. And the convention in modern linguistics is to focus solely on I-language rather than e-language. And we're going to have a look at those in a bit more detail now. So, Aestheticalism is this theory, okay, that is not purely science-based in the hard sense, but it is to do with an empirical approach to language, which actually studies the subject of language and languages in their own right, which is crucial for this kind of thing. So we're going to go and have a look and just look at what the modern linguistics sort of gives us a foundation in, because this is what we're trying to almost avoid or develop on. We're trying to veer away a little bit from the modern linguistic approach and have a look at a different context in which we can look at language, and which is what is offered by aestheticalism. So modern linguistics, as I've just said before, chiefly focuses on internal language or I-language, okay, and has a positivist approach. So when we analyze languages, we're looking at languages as an object of study. We're looking at the evidence, and we're drawing conclusions from that evidence, okay, and any kind of changes in that evidence merits a change in our theory. What I'm going to talk about is that type of approach doesn't quite allow us to understand language in every context. Okay, so there are questions which we are missing, which we'll go into as well. And modern linguistics generally, since the Chomskyan revolution back in the 50s, 60s, linguistics is generally considered as a subfield of psychology. So rather than linguistics being a purely a subject in its own right, it's more of a subfield of psychology. The way that we analyze language is from a psychological perspective, rather than a purely, what I would say personally, a glossologic perspective, a purely linguistic approach, that we look at language as the main subject. And it is in that where I think there has been some things that are missing. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at some of the foundational aspects of particularly this course, and also what we've been talking about as well in terms of modern linguistics, and we're just going to put it all in context. Okay, so we have I-language and E-language. Also, if you want to use the Saussurean definitions of langue and parole, that is there as well. It's more or less the same context, more or less the same thing that's going on, and we're going to just have a look and see what the definitions are and just go into that in a bit more detail. So first of all, we'll start with I-language. So I've used trusty old Wiktionary here just to get a definition of I-language, because I thought this summed it up quite well. So internal language. Language is perceived and understood in the individual rather than as transmitted and shared in the world or community. Okay, so this I would suggest is the abstract concept of language. So not languages as we understand them, as in Spanish, French, Italian, so on, but the abstract concept of what is language as a psychological phenomenon. Okay. And one of the key parts of this, particularly with when Chomsky introduced this, is that grammar creates languages and not the other way around. This is the generativist approach, of course, that grammar is the creator of language, and that's the general idea of the first idea of in Chomsky's linguistics. But the point still stands of what is meant here, that internal language, grammar, is the core part of what we're studying, and it doesn't matter if you believe that it's hardwired or that it might be more as metaphor, as in cognitive linguistics. What we're studying is the internal psychology of language, and not languages, the more concrete thing that we're going to have a look at today. And the biggest thing about this, and I think most linguists would agree on, is that the distinctions between languages, that should be are arbitrary and unscientific. Sorry about that. Are arbitrary and unscientific, and this is kind of the central point when it comes to linguistics, is that language as an object, so a language, so French, is a completely arbitrary and unscientific definition. It's a useless concept for us to understand when we're talking about a language. And I language should be the main study of linguistics. This is kind of what came out of the Chomskyan revolution, that I language is meant to be the main study, the subject of what we're interested in, and that anything else, word forms, different grammars, all of those things are all just pointers to the main subject. Okay, and there's a nice quote by Chomsky, which sort of sums up the approach of I language over E language, and this is from his book Rules and Representations. We say that Chinese is a language with many dialects, and that French, Italian, and Spanish are different languages, but the diversity of the Chinese dialects is roughly comparable to that of the Romance languages. So what Chomsky is sort of talking about here is that external language is a useless concept, essentially. He also talks about how there are variations of Dutch, which are more, I think what he says is more comparable to German, and so on, or it might be the other way around, I can't quite remember, but he talks about that, how the idea of a language is a political concept. It's more of a political concept. It's something that we are less attuned to when we talk about linguistics. When we talk about linguistics, we're actually focusing on the internal side of it. And this quote by Chomsky is meant to just sort of exemplify that the idea of a language as a definition is a useless concept. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is just e-language. Okay, so we're just going to have a look at what e-language means. Okay, so I've done the same. I've taken it from Wiktionary here, which is just the opposite. It's essentially the opposite of I-language. It's external language. So language as transmitted and shared in the world or community, rather than perceived and understood in the individual. So in this context, what we're looking at is language as the externalization of the internal language. Okay, so what we're talking about here are word forms, differences in grammar, and so on. And this is basically, when we talk about external language, what we're talking about. So we're talking about the actual concrete representation of a language, and is often the political definition of a language. Okay, so this is what we understand as French. For instance, what is French when we're talking about it? Or what is Spanish? What is Italian? What is Greek? You know, when we talk about these languages, we're talking about what they are in that type of context. We're talking about the political definition of a language. And of course, this can get very messy, because you try and understand, well, is Andalusian Spanish different from Northern Spanish, for instance? You know, it gets into complicated things as well. And what is Spanish as an actual political concept? So that's why it's very much mainly political. It is the layman's view of language. So it's how we understand language and perceive languages as ourselves. Okay, as just like a normal person looking at a language. So it is almost like the nationalized version of a language. Okay, so this is why it's the political view. Now, someone on the street might just say, well, that's Greek and that's Georgian, for instance. Maybe. I've seen videos where the average where you can get them quite mixed up especially when you're talking about Greek and Spanish, but things like that, you can make those sort of definitions. So in Georgia they speak Georgian, in Russia they speak Russian. As linguists, we understand that's not a completely accurate statement to make, and that is why e-language is not considered the main focus of linguistics. Okay, so in modern linguistics, it is I-language and not e-language which is considered to be the main subject of study. Now, again, e-language is said to be arbitrary and unscientific. Who's to say what is a language and what is a dialect? Many people here in Spain will say that Catalan is a dialect of Spanish. Linguistically and empirically, that's not actually the case. But that's the sort of the concept. And who is to say what is a language and what isn't? As linguists, we should be objective and we should be understanding this from an objective point of view. And ultimately, it's a matter of geopolitics. That's kind of what it is. So when we call something a language, it's often viewed as a matter of geopolitics. E-language is the expression of I-language and therefore merely an intermediary or to understanding language in the abstract. So basically what this means is that e-language is just in the way of I-language. E-language is what we need to decipher and to get to the actual code of it, to actually get to the information that we want to understand. And this is basically the central issue of what we're trying to do as linguists. We're essentially, if you want to put it in a more computer science context, we are the programmers. We're using a programming language to talk to the computer, and this is basically what we're trying to do. We're going through e-language to understand I-language. That is the main sort of concept. Okay, so, and what happens is that a lot of linguists tend to concede certain stages. So we believe in the idiolect, we believe in the sociolect, we even go as far as to say the dialect, but we often draw a big red line before we get to language. Okay, and language is considered this concept that, again, is not definable. Okay, and we're willing to go so far as to say dialect. We can talk about a dialect continuum, that there are languages that flow into that continuum and they fall on the different lines, that they're on a spectrum, but ultimately it's always zooming into the idiolect and how the individual speaks, and then zooming out, and you can only get as far as dialect. That's kind of the sort of the modern convention in linguistics, and it ultimately is summed up by the infamous quote by Max Weinreich: "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." And that is essentially what I mean when I say a nationalized language, a standardized language. And diglossic societies are a very good example of this. Italian, for instance, is very much perceived to be a standardized artificial language, which covers most of the, which covering the Italian peninsula, but in reality it's a diglossic society where many Italians don't actually speak Italian in their day-to-day. They generally speak their own regional language. Now, problems with this approach. Okay, so as aestheticalists, well, as an aestheticalist myself, or according to aestheticalism, most of this is not incorrect, but misguided in many respects, and there are lots of problems with this type of approach. Okay, and we're just going to go into a couple of them and have a look at them. So, first of all, it's too narrow. Okay, with the great advances that we have had focusing on I-language, rather than on e-language, we've managed to answer a lot of questions pertaining to syntax, phonology, all of these things. We've been able to answer a lot of interesting questions with this approach on just focusing on the psychological aspects of language. However, we're talking about languages here. We're not talking just purely about psychology. And there are lots of things that we don't know or can answer effectively just using a purely positivist psychological approach. Okay, so I would say that this approach is too narrow. It's too narrow into understanding what we actually want to find out. Okay, language definition is not necessarily arbitrary. There are ways in which we can define language definition. We can actually define what a language is. There are objective measures that we can put in, and we miss out on the philosophical nature of a language. Okay, so we miss out on some important philosophical questions pertaining to language, pertaining to ourselves, when we do a purely positivist approach. And I think probably the worst thing as well is that we leave out important linguistic related questions. So we'll just go through all of these and just understand what the actual issue is. So with narrow, so there are obviously still mysteries with linguistics in languages that we don't understand. There are obviously things that we want to understand, which we can't do because it's because of the way in which we see our language through a purely scientific perspective. And a glossopoetic approach, an artistic perspective, is trying to understand language from a different point of view in order to answer some of those questions. So what aestheticalism attempts to be is more complementary in this approach to the information that we've already discovered, because we are interested in understanding language and languages. Again, so we can define languages through objective measures, linguogenetic relationships, that's language families, how they branch off each other. That can help us provide information about what is a language and what is definable as a language. And of course, mutual intelligibility as well. Quite an unpopular definition, because a lot of people regard it as quite arbitrary, but mutual intelligibility is actually very useful in a lot of contexts to defining language differences, and also using those two, linguogenetic relationships and mutual intelligibility, and actually calculating that in a numeric view, quantitatively, we can understand what could be a language and what couldn't be. Okay, and again, philosophical things. So important philosophical questions. What is the significance of language, and to us as individuals, and also to society? What does language actually mean? What is its use? What is its purpose? How has it come into the world? And those are questions that I really want to try and answer in these lectures as well, using an aestheticalist approach. And of course, as I said, we leave out important linguistic related questions. So linguistic diversity, why do we have so many languages? What's the actual reason for that? Why do we have so many languages? And why are languages so complex? Some languages are very, very, very complicated to understand, even from a positivist approach. It takes full grammar books to fully map out what people tend to use in their day-to-day, and it's quite bizarre as to why that exists. Why don't we all speak the same language? And I think this is my main gripe with the sort of pragmatic belief in the origin of language, and we're going to have a look at that in the next lecture as well. Why don't we speak all the same language, or at least similar languages that are based in with similar grammars, similar structures? Why don't we do that? And why is language communication so poor? Because a lot of the time we have to rely on other methods to be able to communicate effectively, and communication is a very big part of language, and we can talk and communicate exactly what we need, but often there are discrepancies, and it often falls down, and in a lot of ways we don't always get it right the first time, and which you would have thought by now we might have perfected. Okay, and what is the main driving force behind sound change? And this is going to be our one of our central focuses in one of the following lectures. What is the driving force behind language? And what I will try and argue is that it's aesthetics which drives language change, rather than the assumption of the ease of articulation. Okay, and all this can be just summed up in just this phrase: we're not just interested in the function or psychology of language, but also the nature and beauty of languages as well. Okay, so we're looking at languages from an artistic perspective because we're interested in finding out what is the nature and the beauty of languages. Okay, as glossopedists, I think we can understand this a bit better than a scientific linguist. We can understand this from a different point of view. We're interested in the beauty of language because that's what we trade in, that's what we deal with every day. We do the beauty of language in our studies, in our understanding, and that's really what we're trying to investigate here with aestheticalism. And aestheticalism is providing a framework, a theory in which we can work in a glossopoetic context, because we're interested in finding out why languages and how why languages exist and how they work. And I think this is answerable through an aesthetical approach. But of course, this doesn't mean we're throwing out all the language focused studies out the window. Of course, that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm not advocating for a purely aesthetical approach to language, because, like I said, I would like this to be complementary. Okay, and the way that we need to be complementary is to adapt to the nature of the object of study. So we're studying languages. That's ultimately what we're trying to do as linguists. And there are things about languages and language that we can't understand without a non-positivist view. And that's that would be my sort of main point, my main motivation for aestheticalism to exist. We need to look at languages in their own right in the macro view. Again, if we're going to borrow some economic language here, we need to look at languages in a macro view rather than a purely micro view. We need to look at languages as themselves in their own right. Okay, so these are the main sort of motivations for why I want aestheticalism to be something that we can evolve on and think about languages in this type of context, and try and account for certain things in this way. So what I want to do now is just have a look at some of the influences of aestheticalism. It's what we're looking at is that it's very much influenced through language creation. If you're a language creator, you might be able to understand where this particular perspective comes from when it comes to language. We're looking at languages from a glossopoetic context. We're looking at it from the discoveries made in Glossopedia, and personally in my own Glossopedia. A lot of this is from my own experience, from what I've had a look at in creating languages and what I've understood from languages and about languages through language creation. So that's one major influence. Philosophy as well. This is going to have particularly in the next lecture, we're going to have a deep dive into philosophy. Not a saturated one, but we're just going to have a look into the deeper meaning behind language and where it comes from, and also some other things. So we're going to look at some metaphysics in relation to what exists in terms of what is the individual, and some of the main drivers of language and linguistics. I should say language and languages. We're going to have a look into that, and of course, a major important part is aesthetics, and aesthetics is what we're mainly going to be focusing on, because obviously this is aestheticalism. Right. Okay. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've made it through the whole of the video. I'm going to do the other lectures, and I'm just going to keep on talking about this. I understand if some of this might be a bit weird, and maybe a bit controversial in terms of modern linguistics. It is a personal thing as well. I've only come up with this to just from my own understanding of language and linguistics. I've come to this conclusion. I'd like any sort of criticism, any kind of tweaks or anything, or if there's anything that I've said which is just plainly wrong, I don't mind if you point that out to me. I would love it if you would leave that. We'll leave those points in the comments. If you do agree with what I've been saying, or you think that I might have a point, it's possible. You can also leave a comment as well with that. So I'm very glad that I've been able to start this. I think this is going to be quite interesting as well. And in the next lecture, we're going to have a look at language's essence and understand language from a more philosophical point of view. So yeah, fantastic. So I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.